I'm a lapsed physician, and I became a venture capitalist because I wanted to translate the foundational work in research to put it in patients' hands. And I also talk of myself as the pre-enlightened me and the post-enlightened me. And the post-enlightened me is someone who really is passionate about the disparities in women's health, and I'm a proselytizer. Now, the pre-enlightened me sat through Harvard Medical School using the iconic 70-kilogram man, white man. It was very explicit. There was no apology about it, and never blinked an eyelid. I did research on mice and used male mice. I didn't think about it. I was unenlightened. And then suddenly, never mind how, I suddenly woke up and realized just the absolute gap, chasm, between where women's health ought to be and where it is. And then I'm now obsessed, passionate, and that's all I want to think about. And that's who I am. So we are extraordinarily lucky today to have three panelists who founded centers of women's health research and are tenured faculty in women's health research. You probably have an idea of how rare that is. And we have three very rare specimens here talking to you, telling you about the cutting edge and discoveries in women's health and tying it into this whole landscape of where we have to go. And so the layout is, the outline is that each one will speak for 10 minutes, and then I will ask them questions and then turn it over to Q&A. So the first person to speak will be Dr. Carolyn Mazure. She's the creator and director of the Center on Women's Health Research at Yale, and professor in women's health research and professor of psychology and psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine. Her research is on the gender differences between men and women in depression and the role that stress plays in depression. Our next speaker will be Dr. Judy Regensteiner. She's the creator and director of the Center for Women's Health Research and professor of medicine at the University of Colorado. Her expertise is in cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, and here again she will highlight the differences in men and women in this disease pathology. And the third speaker is Dr. Marjorie Jenkins. She's the founding director of the Laura Bush Institute for Women's Health and also a tenured professor at the Texas Tech University Health Science Center. And she's currently on a sabbatical at the FDA's Office of Women's Health Research. So she has also some very interesting stories to tell us from the regulatory perspective and also from the holistic perspective of where we ought to be. So I welcome Dr. Mazure, our first speaker.
Thank you, Anula, very much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So many familiar faces and people I've come to care about as well as Carolee and Lynn. I also find it a great privilege to follow Dr. Vivian Penn. I had the opportunity to learn from her in the 1990s when I was a kid growing up in science, and I learned well, I think, because she was such a fantastic model. One of the things that I want to talk about today, though, before I start with a few slides, is this concept of have we made progress? Because I think it's a theme that I've heard last night and heard today, and Vivian addressed it. I know it's on Carolee's mind and many people's minds. I think that among the people that I learned from also were Bernadine Healy, for example, who Vivian mentioned. And what Bernadine talked about was women's health being the third suffrage movement. The first being the vote, the second being the ERA, and the third being women's health. And that this was going to take time, this was going to be a process, this was going to be a long-term journey. I do think we've made significant progress, and I think it's because of people like Vivian and others. But I think that's what really important is you're going to continue to hear these themes of bias, conscious bias and unconscious bias. But we shouldn't be deferred by that. We shouldn't be put off by that. We shouldn't be surprised by that. I once had, and Dale Adkins here will appreciate this, but I once had a supervisor when I was growing up in psychology who said to me, you know, Carolyn, you believe in the unconscious, but when you see it, you can't believe it. And so I want to, you know, and temperamentally, I guess I'm just cautiously optimistic. But I think that we've made terrific progress. But I think you're going to hear these themes. I think it's part of the long-term journey and the suffrage movement. And today what I want to do now is focus a little bit on the issue of why we should study women's health and what we're learning from some of that. I think we've spent some time previously in our meetings talking about why we haven't studied women. Now I'm going to turn the direction of it slightly to why we should study women. So if I could have the next, oh, I control it, great. Isn't that nice for medicine? And is it the big green button? Okay, great. So the original premise from which we all work is that improvement in health and healthcare for everyone really depends on generating new empirical knowledge that then we can use. We can use it in our professional practice, we can use it in our personal practice, and we've all reviewed the fact that the prevailing tradition, as Vivian said and others, was not to include women in clinical trials. And even though Vivian and others fought very hard for the fact that the clinical equity provision within the NIH Revitalization Act said that we also had to be accountable about analyzing the data by outcome. Am I right, Vivian? That still to this day, we are fighting that battle, where if you look at many scientific studies, you're not finding that analysis. So why should women be studied? I think for starters, these are some of the reasons. First of all, women suffer from chronic diseases and disability much more likely than do men. It was just about 2 or 3 weeks ago that the American College of Physicians put out a very important report, again, reinforcing this idea and saying we have to pay attention to this and we have to do something about this. Women are more likely to have acute and chronic pain. Women are more likely to die after heart attack. We're more likely to develop depression and anxiety. As Anula said, my area of study historically has been depression. And what we know is that in replicated studies over and over again, we find that in the United States, the rate of depression in women is twice as high as it is in men. That the rates of depression in boys and girls is about the same, but after puberty, those rates start to diverge, and the rates remain higher in women lifelong. They vary absolutely by epoch, by life epoch, but nonetheless, there's always that difference between women and men. And the World Health Organization now has studied this around the globe. And independent of the society and whether it's a developing economy or an emerging economy, you find that same difference between women and men. Again, absolute rates may vary, but that difference persists. Women are more likely to have autoimmune illnesses. What are those? Well, thyroid disease, 15 times more common in women than men. Lupus, 9 times more common in women than men, particularly African American women. Women are more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, as Meryl well knows and talks to us about regularly. I recently had the opportunity to publish an article in The Lancet, which is an international scientific journal, where we were able to really bring to people's attention something very important with regard to the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic is raging in this country, and now it's raging in Canada. There's serious concern that it's going to spread globally for a whole variety of reasons. And it's not something where we're just going to end this epidemic. We're going to have to stem the tide, and then we're going to have to deal with the sequelae of this epidemic for generations to come. And everybody knows about the epidemic generally, but what we don't know about, and what I was able to bring to Lancet's attention and that they welcomed, was how there are so many gender differences in opioid use and misuse, and that if we don't understand that, we are not going to stem the tide of this epidemic. And as we study women, this is the important turning point. As we study women, what we find is there is difference. There's difference in terms of the prevalence of different disorders, the risk factors, the way in which we present with various symptoms, heart attack being such a classic example. And we find that the course of illnesses, the way in which they initially present and then how they play out, can be different for women and men. Just some examples: osteoporosis, stroke, osteoarthritis. In the last minute that I have today, I'll only focus on one of those points, and that's research. And it's because we've been talking about pilot studies, I wanted to show you just a couple examples of the pilot studies that we have generated out of our center. So our center is 20 years old. We've funded over 90 pilot studies. It's cost us about $5 million. The pilot study investigators have gone out, collected their data, and then applied for larger grants and have brought into their own laboratories then to continue the work that they've begun, $95 million of new dollars. And this has really been a great success for us, not just because of the money, but because now we have investigators in particular areas who hadn't previously looked at women and sex and gender difference doing exactly that. And finally, and interestingly, just as one example, we have somebody who is in neuroscience who's studying for the first time what the brains of women and men are doing in relation to cannabis. I think we're moving way too fast with cannabis here in Colorado. That may not be something that's well received, but we need to know a lot more about it. And it appears as though, if people think, by the way, that you can't become addicted to cannabis, that's a mistake, first of all. Second of all, it may be, just like with cigarettes and alcohol, that women can become addicted more rapidly than men, and we're trying to figure that out. We also have studies on autism, and we have studies on obvious things that are important to women, like breast cancer. But all of these are revolutionary ideas, the point of which is to show you the scope, that it's possible. Our center was founded in 1998 because we're a self-sustaining center within Yale, and I was able to bring in a very large grant to sustain this work, and we're very pleased to be part of this larger issue that's being brought up today with Carol Lee about a collaborative and really trying to work together to bring things to the fore. Thank you.
I founded, with my colleagues, the Center for Women's Health Research at the University of Colorado in 2004 at a time when there wasn't a whole lot of interest in my campus. People told me no one in the community will be interested in learning about research, which I just didn't believe. Turns out if you speak in plain English and explain what you're finding, everyone has their jargon, so if you take the jargon out of it, people love research, and the community has made us successful by supporting us, by having a community board, by having big-time philanthropy involved in the center. It's made a huge difference. Now it's a major initiative at my school, and this is totally thrilling. What we do at the University of Colorado is, for the center, before I launch into a brief description of my research, which I can tell you about everything in 5 minutes, I guess, but I will, is we do the cutting-edge research in women's health and sex differences, which is an important way to look at women's health, by doing the research in particular in the areas of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and now mental health and the role of brain-body interface, which I think is incredibly important. And the second part of our mission is to educate and mentor the young scientists, the workforce, as Carolyn described, where we're mentoring 64 young MD and PhD scientists, both men and women. To have a real field, you got to have both men and women studying women's health and sex differences. And these are brilliant young scientists who are really interested in the field. We're helping to fund them. We bring them in. We capture their interest, and we keep them forever. And that's exciting. We've leveraged, for those of you in the business community, we've given out about $1.7 million in seed grants, and we also have NIH funding for mentoring. And from that $1.7 million, we have leveraged $65 million in research funding from the National Institutes of Health and other funders. So we're seeding the field, we're growing the field, and it's really exciting. The third part of our mission, and equally important, is educating the public and healthcare providers so that everyone knows the ultimate way to treat women and women's health as we learn what we need to learn. We still don't know so much. My colleague, Dr. Larry Cahill at UC Irvine, spoke to my center. We have an annual signature lunch in the fall for 800 people, and he spoke to the center, and he said that of the top 20 drugs that are prescribed in the United States, most of them or all of them have not been studied in enough women, because women weren't in the clinical trials, to know if they work similarly in women and men. That's kind of shocking. In fact, it's incredibly shocking, and that can't continue. So we have a lot of work in front of us, and I think it's really exciting work. And I resolved to study women's health, and that played a major role. I'm sure everyone here has a story in their own lives of why it's so important. And that is so important because women's health is still incredibly understudied, despite the efforts of Dr. Vivian Pinn, who has made a huge difference in my life and those of so many others. It's still understudied. So what I study is type 2 diabetes and the cardiovascular consequences. My work is at the intersection of cardiology and endocrinology. Women seem to suffer worse consequences than men. We published a paper in the journal Circulation a few years ago where we actually compared men and women. And there are some things that are worse in men than women. I mean, that should be noted too. Like schizophrenia is more present in men than in women, and many other things. But women suffer disproportionately from the cardiovascular consequences of type 2 diabetes. And why, we don't know. So this is kind of a pioneering field. It's really exciting to be in that field. My colleague, Dr. Jane Roosh, is an endocrinologist, and I work together to make these studies. Part of my work is identifying problems. The other part is identifying solutions. So I am hard at work looking at how we can fix this. Can we fix it through an exercise program? That's what I'd like to think. I'm working in adults. My colleagues are working in teenagers, so with type 2 diabetes. So we have, the Center for Women's Health Research goes across the lifespan, beginning in the womb and going across the lifespan. And so we have pediatricians are part of our workforce, as well as what we call adult docs. As far as I know, all docs are adults, right? But we call them adult docs and pediatricians. It's just how it is. So we're working as a group to identify both problems, causes, and solutions. So I think that's my last slide. I don't know, am I out of time? Okay, so I will stop. And thank you for listening.
As you heard, I founded the Laura Bush Institute for Women's Health. I was a young associate professor at Texas Tech at the time. I did not know what I did not know, which was good. And after I wrote the proposal for Mrs. Bush, they asked me to be the executive director of the Institute. I was like, what? You need to go out and get somebody much more experienced. But, you know, I had passion and I had belief. And what I believed was that we had hidden in medicine the best kept secret for thousands of years. We were actually delivering one-sex medicine to men and women and boys and girls without any thought to how that impacted their health and outcomes. So I was a chemical engineer before medicine. I was a control systems designer at Kodak, and I love data. I'm a nerd. Sex and gender, these are not interchangeable terms. These are unique. Sex is your biology and anatomy and physiology. Gender is a social construct. It's environmental. It's how our environment interacts with us, because how it perceives we are presenting ourselves. So this is a spectrum and a very complex issue. So sex is biology, and when I say sex differences, I will be talking about that specifically. And gender is when you heard about implicit bias, which is absolutely rampant throughout healthcare delivery. But this is what we do. This is why we do research. This is why we teach the doctors and physicians of tomorrow. This is why I've spent the past 20 years of my career doing this, because sex and gender impacts everything about our health. So talking about the genome, that we have 25,000 genes packed in to each cell. Every cell has a sex. That is important. What we may not know is that when we look at male to male, we have 99.9% genetic similarity. The same with males to primates. Males to females, 98%. And even females to female, and we'll talk about that I think Anula is going to talk about that at her panel discussion next. So I'm not going to go through this. But genetic differences between men and women and chimps are not just the number of differing genes, but how they are expressed. That is research from the cell to the patient. That's from the bench to the bedside. There are differences that need to be researched. I'm not going to talk about this because we have a geneticist in the room, and she's going to talk about it. But women inactivate one of their X chromosomes. We have two. We are a mosaic of our X chromosomes. Men have one X chromosome. The X chromosome is packed with genes. The Y chromosome is a little bit wimpy. It only has a few. But still, I mean, they're important. I'm not saying that it's not important. I own a couple of guys at home, my family. I love them. So this is a great quote. Human genome, we have a problem. Medicine and research fails to take into the account the most fundamental difference. So I will tell you what is important. You cannot unhear this when you hear it. We all have sex and gender as basic human variables. From the womb to the tomb, it is sex and gender. Your patient, we may have diabetes, we may have hypertension, we may have family history, but we all have sex and gender, and it impacts our health. That is a starting point. It is so scary to me how we are moving to gene-targeted therapy. Gene-targeted therapy without considering sex differences. The first gene-targeted therapy in acute leukemia was approved in February. We don't even report sex differences. This is 2017 on that same disease that the gene-targeting therapy was approved. There is no, I eat this stuff for breakfast. I just pull up the PDF and look for sex and gender. Then I look for women and men. I don't find it. It's unisex reporting. We can't get answers. So we're speeding toward personalized medicine without looking for clinically meaningful differences. There is bias in the research pipeline across the board where animals, cells, males and females, in human trials actually, this data is only for some diseases. In some diseases, women are at parity. Women are being included in clinical trials at high rates. Cardiovascular trials, we just published a decadal review in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology about the efficacy and safety of all the drugs approved by FDA over the last 10 years. Women were included. The drugs were proven safe and effective. But the issue is we don't do that all the time. We aren't requiring analysis until the new policy at NIH was implemented in 2016. I love the global female population. I love it when women are called a subgroup, aren't you? Like when anybody, even if you don't love math, 51% is not a minority. Subgroup, that's ridiculous. Subpopulation. Women are the majority. But more than that, we are the healthcare consumer majority. We make 80% of the healthcare consumer decisions. The World Health Organization says women actually are the 80% of health consumers in the world. And then I make the decision for the other 20% in my family. So I'm like 100% of the healthcare consumer. So if you want a business model, target women. They make the decisions. You convince women that you are the best place to get care. They will send their friends and their family, and they will get people into your healthcare system. Without the data, science cannot find the answer. But the thing I love about sex and gender research and clinical care is that it matters to everyone. I care that my son has good health. I want my husband to live a long time. It's not just about women. It is about men and boys as well. And that's what I love about this discussion, is that we're moving women's health past bikini medicine, and we're moving it to truly precision medicine for everyone that we care about and for the good of the public health. So here is my wrap up. You have research there. I have raised millions of dollars for research. The Laura Bush Institute funds research and pilot studies, much like my colleagues. We are the national leaders in building curricular materials to teach nurses, pharmacists, and doctors about this, because wouldn't you want your doctor to know? Wouldn't you want your pharmacist to know? That's where my passion is, because one aha moment that I had is that research will not save one life unless it's taught to a provider. Think about it. Great discovery, life-changing, cure for cancer will not save one life on the bench. It has to be taught. And we're not doing that. We are absolutely not doing that. So if you don't have the research, you can't teach. If you can't teach, you can't reach the patient. These are all points of engagement that we must make in order to make a difference. The ripple effects are extensive. We have to move past equality to evidence. Women's health is evidence that this matters to our health outcomes. We have to move past inclusion. As Vivian talked about inclusion, we have to move out past that. Don't include women. Analyze the data. Get the outcomes. So from inclusion to outcomes. And we must move past expectations, expecting this to happen, to action, which is exactly why I love being here this weekend. Because you are, as Carolee said, fixers. I love fixers. I'm a fixer. So let's fix this, because we can. Thank you very much.